The town of Dry Creek lay low and dusty. A scatter of wooden fronts and rickety porches pressed hard against the endless Arizona plain. By day it seemed tired, as though the desert sun had baked it into stillness. By sundown it grew mean, restless, and quick to anger. That evening, as the last of the light drained away behind the jagged purple ridges of the mountains, the air itself carried a weight, the kind that made shutters close and doors bar earlier than usual. A storm wasn't brewing in the sky, but among the people it began with whispers. Always the way with trouble. Mrs. Callahan, coming back from the general store with flour in her arms, swore she'd seen a copper-skinned boy darting out from the side door, his hands clenched around something shiny. The storekeeper, old Mr. Renshaw, confirmed it in half a breath, said he was missing coins from the till and a piece of jewelry left by a rancher's wife for safekeeping. Soon the tale grew. The boy wasn't just a thief, but a spy, a scout for raiding parties said to prowl the hills. Within the hour, half the town believed Apache arrows were already being notched in the darkness beyond the ridge dot. By the time the sun bled red against the horizon, a crowd had gathered near the saloon. It started with half a dozen men, then swelled to 20. Ranch hands and drifters, storekeepers and gamblers, all drawn by the easy fire of shared fear. Torches were lit, more for the show of it than the light, and the mob seemed to feed on its own shadow. Each man's voice rose louder than the next, telling how the savages had taken this, burned that, murdered someone they knew from a town farther east. The details blurred and shifted, but the rage solidified into one target. The boy. He'd been caught easily, as frightened children often are. Sheriff Mallory himself had no hand in. He was gone 2 towns over on business, but a group of men cornered the boy behind the stables, dragged him by the arm to the center of town. He couldn't have been more than 12, thin as a whip. Barefoot, his clothes no more than rags. He didn't cry, not once. His silence unnerved them more than begging would have, so they gripped him harder and spat sharper words to mask it. The boy stood under the hanging lantern outside the saloon, his dark eyes glinting with something unreadable. He wasn't tall enough to face any of them eye to eye, but his stillness had a weight that pressed against the mob's noise. A few women peered from windows, their faces pale in the lamplight, clutching children to their skirts. No one stepped forward. Fear had a way of twisting this town, of turning hunger and hard times into cruelty. Dry Creek sat too close to Apache land for comfort, yet too far from soldiers' forts for protection. Every family had a story of a stolen cow, a burned wagon, or a missing neighbor. Truth or rumor no longer mattered. To them, this boy embodied all of it. He was the scapegoat they could finally put their hands on, and so the talk turned uglier. Rope was fetched. Someone muttered about making an example before the tribe struck again. Another man laughed and said he had a fine oak beam ready on his porch. Their voices swelled until it sounded like a verdict. The desert wind picked up, rattling loose boards, carrying with it the faint smell of sage and dust. The last line of sunlight had disappeared, leaving only the glow of torches. Against that flickering light, the boy's thin figure looked smaller still, like a shadow, on the verge of being swallowed. The crowd pressed in closer, restless, hungry for blood but not yet brave enough to spill it. They needed one spark, one push, and the deed would be done. That was the hour, the edge of night, with justice about to curdle into vengeance. When she stepped forward, the mob had grown louder, voices colliding in a chorus of rage and drink. Men shoved closer to the boy, their shadows thrown tall by the torches. A coil of rope swung from one man's hand, its loop already tied. They had no judge, no jury, only a verdict burning in their eyes. It was then a figure moved from the edge of the boardwalk, stepping down into the dust. She wore no gun at her hip, only a plain calico dress faded by the sun. A wide-brimmed hat shaded her face, though strands of auburn hair slipped loose against her cheeks. The schoolteacher, Miss Ellen Hayes. To some, she was just the stubborn Easterner who'd come west with more books than sense. To others, she was the only one who dared speak her mind in a town that prided itself on silence. She walked steadily, each step tapping against the dry earth until she reached the boy's side. For a moment the crowd faltered, the rope stilled. In the man's hand, the sight of a woman between them and their anger jarred them like cold water thrown in the face. Ellen didn't flinch. She planted herself before the boy, her back straight, her eyes steady as flint. "You'll not lay a hand on him," she said, her voice carrying sharper than the crack of a whip. The words cut through the din. Men shifted uneasily, muttering. The leader of the pack, Tom Jeffers, a rancher with more temper than cattle, sneered and spat into the dirt. "Step aside, Miss Hayes. This ain't your business." She met his gaze without blinking. "It's every person's business when a child's neck is threatened by rope. A thief ain't a child. He's a savage," Jeffers shot back, jabbing his finger at the boy. "One of them that'll cut your throat soon as look at you. Best to end it before he runs back to his people with word of our weakness." Ellen's chin lifted. Weakness is men with torches against a boy half their size. The mob rumbled with discontent, but no one yet dared move against her. Her reputation was peculiar in Dry Creek, half admired, half mocked. She taught their children their letters, bound up more than one cut or fever when the doctor rode off elsewhere. And she'd never once bowed her head when insulted. That earned her a strange sort of respect, the kind that kept fists in pockets even when tongues grew sharp. The boy said nothing, though his small hands were clenched so tight the knuckles whitened against his dark skin. Ellen felt him trembling behind her, and though she wanted to glance back, she did not. Her strength had to be absolute, or the mob would see the crack. "Miss Hayes." Another man spoke, older, voice thick with whiskey. "No one asked you to meddle. This here's justice. Town's got to keep order." "Order is built on truth," she replied, her voice rising. "And not one of you has seen him steal a thing with your own eyes. All you've got are whispers." And fear. Her words struck deeper than she knew. A few men looked at their boots. Others shifted their torches uneasily. The desert wind pressed against the silence, making the flames gutter. Still, Jeffers wasn't moved. "You'd defend him, would you? Over your own kind?" "I'll defend any child from a rope," she said firmly. Then, lowering her voice, "Just enough to pierce the hush," she added, "and if you mean to hang him, you'll have to hang me first." Gasps broke out from the edges of the crowd. A woman had said what none of them expected. Not plea, not compromise, but challenge. Jeffers's face twisted, caught between rage and the shame of striking down a woman in front of his neighbors. He barked a laugh, hollow and forced. "You're mad," he said. "Perhaps," Ellen answered, "but I'd rather be mad than cruel." The boy's breath hitched behind her. For the first time, his eyes lifted from the ground to the woman's. Straight back. Something flickered there, hope, though fragile as the thin dawn yet to come. The mob hung in its moment of decision, balanced between violence and retreat. Ellen stood with her hands loose at her sides, not clenched, not shaking, but ready. She was one figure against dozens, but her courage filled the street like a wall of stone. The torches sputtered in the wind, smoke drifting up to the rising stars. The town of Dry Creek waited, its heart paused in the dust as the schoolteacher faced down a mob with nothing but her voice and her resolve. The silence that followed Ellen Hayes' defiance was brief, brittle as glass. Then, like a whip crack, the muttering began again, first low, then rising, as men found their voices in one another. They did not like being challenged, least of all by a woman. The torches burned low, casting long shadows across the dirt street. and the shadows looked like twisted specters of the mob itself. "She's bewitched by the boy," someone shouted. "Fool woman siding with savages," another spat. "Get her out of the way." The words were ugly, but what gave them teeth was the sound of agreement that rolled behind them. Ellen felt the shift immediately, the wavering hesitation that had bought her a sliver of safety began to harden back into anger. Fear had retreated for only a heartbeat. Now it returned sharpened by wounded pride. Tom Jeffers, his broad shoulders thrown forward like a bull about to charge, stepped closer until he loomed only a few feet away. His face, raw from years of sun and whiskey, twisted with scorn. The torchlight gleamed off the sweat on his brow. "You hear that, Miss Hayes?" he growled. "You think one woman's voice is stronger than all of ours? You're standing between this town and its right to survive." Her gaze didn't falter. "I'm standing between justice and murder." That word murder hit the crowd like a thrown stone. Some cursed, others bristled, but none wanted the weight of it spoken aloud. To lynch a thief was one thing, to be branded murderers was another. Jeffers snarled, pointing at the boy. "That creature ain't innocent. Don't you see it? He's Apache. That's all the proof you need. While we waste breath here, his kin could be out there sharpening blades, waiting for us to sleep. You'd rather gamble with our lives for one half-starved thief?" The crowd roared its approval, voices swelling like storm water over stone. Men pounded their fists against porch posts, boot heels stamping against the earth. The mob was no longer many voices, it was one voice, loud and ragged, demanding blood. Ellen's pulse hammered, but she did not step back. Her voice rose above them, fierce and clear. "And if his kin are waiting, what do you think they'll do when they hear their boy was strung up without trial? Do you think they'll ride away and forget? Or will you bring the very war you fear to your own doorsteps?" That cooled them for a moment, but Jeffers knew how to stoke flames. He laughed bitterly, spreading his arms wide. "There it is, neighbors. The schoolmarm tells us savages deserve the same justice as us. She's more Apache than American. Next, she invite 'em into the schoolhouse to teach our children their heathen tongue." A chorus of jeers followed, fueled by drink, fear, and shame. One man, red-eyed with anger, flung his spit into the dirt at Ellen's feet. Another raised his torch higher as though daring her to stand firm. The boy still had not spoken, his small body taut as a bowstring. Ellen could feel the heat of his fear pressing against her back, but she also knew he was watching her closely, weighing something. She kept her shoulders square, her hands loose, her stance unyielding. "Listen to yourselves," she said, quieter now, so that they had to lean in to catch her words. "Your father's brothers, men who bow their heads in church. What will you tell your children tomorrow if tonight you hang a boy with your own hands? That you were brave? That you were just? Or that you were a mob too weak to wait for truth?" The fire of her words licked at them, but anger answered quicker than shame. The man with the rope stepped forward, slapping the coil against his palm. "Enough talk. Out of the way, Miss Hayes." Jeffers grinned at the shift, at the momentum sliding back into his grip. "You heard him. Step aside. Last chance." The mob pressed closer, a wall of bodies, heat, and fury. Ellen felt the ground tremble with their movement. Yet she did not yield. She planted her boots in the dust as if roots had grown there. "No," she said, her voice like a struck bell. "If you hang this boy, you'll do it over my body." The crowd erupted, half enraged, half stunned. A woman had drawn the line where no man dared. Some faces twisted with fury, others faltered with shame, and in that clash the mob teetered, suspended between action and retreat. The torches hissed in the night air, smoke curling skyward like dark prayers. The fury of the mob pressed against her like a tide, but Ellen stood firm. the lone figure between a rope and a boy's neck. The night had grown dangerous, and though the mob's fury was boiling, its courage faltered at the thought of striking her down. The standoff had truly begun. Behind Ellen Hayes, the boy stood as still as stone. The crowd's fury whipped around him, a storm of spit, curses, and smoke, yet he made no sound, not a cry, not a plea. His silence was sharper than any scream could have been. He looked younger than 12, though the hardness in his face made it impossible to be sure. His frame was wiry, ribs showing beneath the thin, ragged cloth that clung to his shoulders. Bare feet pressed into the packed dust of the street, toes curling and uncurling as though testing whether to flee. But he did not run. He did not beg. He did not even shake, though Ellen felt the faint quiver in him when she had first stepped forward. Now it was as though he had folded himself inward, bracing not just against the mob but against the world. The men noticed, and the longer the boy held his silence, the more it unsettled them. They were used to fear that whimpered, fear that pleaded, fear that gave them a sense of power. But this was different. His stillness unnerved them, made him seem older than his years, as though he carried knowledge none of them could touch. "See that?" One man growled, pointing with the end of his torch. "He don't even deny it. Not a word." "You think he's innocent?" "Look in his eyes, Miss Hayes. He ain't afraid because he knows his kin are coming." Another man spat. "Savage devil. They're born liars. Best to keep his mouth shut saves us more falsehoods." Ellen glanced back at the boy then, just briefly. Their eyes met. She saw no pleading there, no desperation for her to save him. What she saw was a depth she could not name, something like pride, something like sorrow. He was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because words would not change what these men believed. Her heart clenched at the sight. She had spent her life teaching children to give voice to themselves, to write words on paper, to speak truth. Yet here was a child who had already learned the futility of speech. He knew no matter what he said, the mob would twist it, mock it, or refuse it. His silence was not weakness, it was a shield. Still she turned to the crowd, refusing to let them use it as proof of guilt. "You call his silence damning," she said, her voice carrying over the torch's hiss, "but I tell you it condemns none but yourselves. What reason has he to speak when every ear here is shut? Would any of you listen if he swore innocence? Or would you call him liar all the same?" A murmur rippled through them. Some shuffled their boots, ashamed to meet her gaze. Others hardened their faces, unwilling to let her words sink in. Jeffers barked a harsh laugh. "Don't waste your breath, Miss Hayes. That boy ain't got a word of English in him. He couldn't beg even if he wanted to. For all we know, he's cursing us in his heathen tongue right now." The mob chuckled darkly at that, though unease still threaded through their laughter. The boy's silence seemed to carry weight, as though his stillness itself were a judgment upon them. Ellen turned back, crouching slightly so her eyes were level with his. She spoke low, soft, words meant only for him. "You don't have to speak," she whispered. "Not to them, not tonight. Your silence is yours." For the first time, something flickered in his face so slight that no one else could have seen it. The corners of his mouth twitched, not toward a smile but toward acknowledgment, as though he had heard her and, in some small way, accepted her shield. The mob pressed forward again, restless, anger straining against hesitation. They could not understand this silence. To them it was proof of savagery, proof of guilt. Yet to Ellen it was proof of survival of a boy who had already learned the cruelty of a world that would not hear him. And as the torches sputtered lower, as the men grew hungrier for action, the boy's silence remained unbroken. It was not surrender, not cowardice, but endurance. And in that endurance, Ellen felt the fragile thread of her own resolve knot tighter. She would not let them break him. Not with ropes, not with jeers. Not with the demand for words he did not owe. The boy stood in silence, and she stood in front of him. Between the two of them, that silence became a wall the mob could not easily tear down. The night pressed in heavy as a blanket, but no one left the street. The mob lingered, milling in restless circles like wolves pacing the edge of firelight. Some men shouted, others muttered in low clusters, but always their eyes returned to the same sight, a schoolteacher standing rigid, her body a frail barricade between them and a boy they hungered to punish. The torches hissed and burned low, throwing erratic shadows across the clapboard walls. Smoke clung to the air, stinging eyes and throats, making tempers roar with each hour. Someone fetched more kerosene, relit 2 torches, but the fire didn't warm them, it only showed how long the night had stretched. Ellen did not move. Her feet ached from the hard ground, her throat was dry, yet she stood straight as a post. The boy remained behind her, silent as before, and she felt his stillness like a weight pressing steady into her spine. That strange calm his refusal to wail or plead strengthened her. If he could endure this mob without bending, so could she. The men tried to break her resolve. Jeffers stepped forward, bellowing threats. "Best move aside, Miss Hayes. Nobody here wants harm to come to you, but don't mistake our patience for weakness. Step off now, and we'll forget you were ever in the way." She answered, steady as stone, "I'm not in the way." "I'm in the right," the crowd growled. Some shouted for action. "Drag her off. She can't stop us all." But none made the move. To strike her, even for the sake of their fury, was to cross a line most of them weren't ready to cross. It was one thing to beat a thief, another to lay hands on the woman who taught their children their letters and stitched their wounds in fever season. That hesitation was her armor, thin but still holding. Hours wore on. The desert air grew colder, stars blazing sharp overhead. The whiskey that had fueled the mob's rage earlier began to sour in their bellies, leaving behind throbbing headaches and bitter stomachs. Some peeled away under the cover of mutters, slipping back to their homes with the excuse of wives waiting or chores at dawn. A few stayed out of pride alone, unwilling to admit weariness. Ellen watched each departure with quiet relief, though she never allowed herself the victory of a smile. Her face stayed hard, her stance unyielding. The boy remained like a shadow. Behind her, breathing softly, his silence the only sound in the narrow space between them. Once, in the middle of the night, a man lurched forward, rope swinging. His boots struck the dirt in uneven strides, and the torchlight showed his face slack with too much drink. "I'll do it myself," he slurred. Ellen did not move aside. She stepped forward instead, closing the gap between them. Her eyes locked on his, cold and clear, unblinking. For a heartbeat he stood there, rope dangling from his hand. Then he faltered, his courage curdling under her steady gaze. With a curse, he spat into the dirt and stumbled back, retreating into the muttering crowd. That moment broke something in the mob. Their threats grew quieter, their shouts weaker. The fire in their voices guttered like the torches they carried. By the time the sky had turned from black to deep indigo, only a handful remained. Jeffers still lingered, pacing like a caged animal, but even he knew the tide was shifting. His jaw clenched with frustration, his eyes darting at the neighbors, who yawned and rubbed their arms against the chill. Ellen's body screamed with fatigue. Her knees ached, her shoulders throbbed from standing so long, but she did not allow herself to sway. She thought of her classroom, of the children bent over slates, their small voices sounding out words. She thought of the mothers who had trusted her to guide their little ones. If she faltered now, what would she teach them? That courage could be shouted down? That justice belonged to whoever shouted loudest? No, she would not falter that the boy's silence became her anchor. As dawn crept closer, she felt him shift only once, his hand brushing lightly against her skirt as though to remind her he was still there. It was not a plea, it was gratitude, unspoken. When the first faint line of pale light edged the horizon, the mob had dwindled to a dozen tired men, their fury spent, their torches burned out. The night-long standoff had not broken Ellen Hayes, it had broken them, and just as the dawn touched the dust, another figure appeared at the edge of town. The first light of dawn crept slowly, as though reluctant to touch the ugliness the night had birthed. A faint silver line traced the horizon, then spread into pale gold that softened the jagged mountains beyond Dry Creek. The torches, once fierce, now lay in embers, smoke drifting low like shame. Men stamped their boots against the chill, rubbing. Hands together, eyes darting toward their homes where warm stoves and breakfasts waited. The fire of their vengeance had cooled in the long hours, leaving only the ash of weariness. Ellen Hayes still stood in the center of the street, her dress coated with dust, her throat raw from speaking against them, her body trembling from exhaustion. Yet she remained upright, her back straight as a post, her shadow long and slender in the slanting light. The boy was still at her side, small, silent, dark eyes fixed ahead. Neither had bent. That was the quiet miracle of the night. Tom Jeffers, whose bluster had carried much of the mob's fury, looked less like a bull now and more like a man cornered by his own pride. His hat hung low over bloodshot eyes, his mouth dry, his boots restless in the dirt. He had promised blood before dawn, but dawn had come without it. Around him, the remaining men shifted uneasily, some glancing away from Ellen's gaze, others muttering excuses about work waiting at the ranch. Their courage had drained with the darkness. And then, from the east, came the sound of hooves. At first faint, a low rhythm carried on the morning air. Then clearer, stronger, the beat of a horse galloping hard across the prairie. Men stiffened, gripping their ropes and knives, eyes scanning the ridges with dread. Fear pricked their hearts. The story they had told themselves, that this boy was a scout, that his people waited just beyond sight, seemed suddenly more than rumor. Ellen turned, her breath catching, but not with fear. She knew this was not the mob story playing out. This was something else, something fated. The rider appeared against the rising sun, a lone figure cresting the ridge. His silhouette was stark, his form straight-backed and tall. The horse beneath him, a rangy bay, churned up dust as it thundered down the slope. As he drew nearer, the details sharpened, dark braids trailing against his shoulders, a rifle slung across his back, the gleam of beaded leather across his chest. His face was hard, proud, unyielding, the face of a warrior. Gasps broke from the townsman. Apache, one muttered, voice trembling. Lord help us, they're here, another whispered. But no war party followed. Only the one rider, cutting through the dawn like a blade. He slowed as he reached the edge of town, reined in the horse, and dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of both grace and power. Dust rose around him, catching in the new light, as though he carried the desert itself into the street. The boy stirred for the first time all night. His head lifted, his eyes widened, and his lips parted. He had not spoken, not begged, not cried, but now a breath escaped him, soft and certain, recognition. The warrior stepped forward, boots firm in the bow. Dirt, his gaze sweeping the mob with the coldness of steel. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to stiffen spines and dry mouths. He stopped only a few paces away, his eyes settling at last on Ellen. For a moment, silence swallowed the street. The mob so loud, all night, had nothing left to say. The rising sun painted the warrior's features in gold, making him seem carved from the very land. His eyes shifted past Ellen to the boy, then back to her, measuring, judging. Ellen did not move. Her hands were steady at her sides, though her body still trembled from fatigue. She met his gaze without fear. She had faced down the mob for this boy. She would not falter now, even if his own kin demanded an answer. Behind her, the boy stepped forward just half a pace. The warrior's face softened barely, but enough that she saw it. This was not a stranger come to claim vengeance. This was a brother come to reclaim blood. The dawn had arrived, and with it, the reckoning. The dawn was full now, spilling golden light across Dry Creek, chasing the last shadows from its crooked boardwalks. The air felt sharper, fresher, but no one in the street breathed easily. The mob stood scattered, worn thin from a night of fury, their courage undone by the sight of the Apache warrior standing firm before them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face marked not with paint but with the quiet dignity of scars and years of hardship. His black hair hung in long braids, beads, glinting faintly in the sun. He moved with a stillness that carried weight, as though the desert itself had risen up and shaped him. In his presence, the swagger of the ranch hands and gamblers seemed to crumble. Ellen's hands clenched lightly at her sides. She had expected the mob to back down eventually, but she had not expected this, to find herself standing between a boy and a man whose gaze could cut stone. The warrior's eyes did not dart nervously as the mob's had. They fixed on her, unwavering, piercing, demanding answer. The boy behind her shifted again, one bare foot scuffing in the dust. His silence was broken only by a sharp inhale, the sound of breath caught at the sight of his kin. He had not spoken all night, but the way he leaned forward now said enough. This was not just any man. This was blood. Ellen stepped slightly aside, but not away. She turned her body so the boy could see his brother fully, yet her stance still shielded him from the mob that lingered. Restless and ashamed, the warrior's eyes flicked briefly to the men Jeffers most of all, whose jaw worked furiously though. No words came. The warrior's hand brushed the rifle at his back, not drawing it, only reminding them it was there. That small gesture sent a ripple through the crowd. Men who had held torches and ropes only hours ago now found excuses to glance down at their boots. Then, with a slow turn of his head, the warrior brought his gaze back to Ellen. He studied her as if she were a puzzle the desert had never set. Before him, a white woman, unarmed, standing against her own kind for a boy not her blood. His eyes narrowed, not in threat but in calculation, weighing whether she was deceiver, fool, or something more rare. Ellen did not speak first. She felt that words, too easily twisted, would only cloud the moment. Instead, she lifted her chin and held his gaze. She let him see the truth in her stance, the dust on her dress from standing all night, the rawness in her throat from speaking against the mob, the exhaustion in her frame that had not yet broken her. She was no threat, no captor. She was a barrier, one she had chosen to be. The boy took another step forward, his shoulder brushing Ellen's skirt. His small hand reached up, not to clutch her for protection this time, but as though asking permission. Ellen shifted only slightly, her body moving enough to clear the path between them. The warrior's eyes softened, though his face remained stern. He gave a single nod, deep and solemn. That nod was not for the boy, it was for her, a recognition. An acknowledgment. Ellen inclined her head in return, a gesture neither submissive nor proud, but equal. She had kept the boy alive through the night. Now in the dawn, she returned him to the one who had the right to guard him. The boy stepped past her at last. He crossed the space between them quickly, almost urgently, bare feet kicking up dust. When he reached his brother, the warrior's hand rested gently on his shoulder. pulling him close in a motion both protective and tender. The boy pressed against him, his silence finally breaking with a shuddered breath, relief flooding out of him in that small sound. The street was hushed. The mob, once so loud, dared not interrupt the exchange. Ellen stood back, her hands loosening at her sides. She felt the ache in her legs now, the weight of the night settling over her, but she did not collapse. She would not collapse before them. The warrior looked at her again. For a long moment, no one else existed in that street but the two of them. No words passed between them, but something deeper did an unspoken covenant of respect. He had seen what she had done, and though they came from worlds apart, he honored it. The silence between them was not emptiness. It was understanding. The sun crested fully over the ridge, spilling light across Dry Creek until the crooked buildings glowed as though the desert itself had caught fire. Shadows retreated into alleys, and the night's ugliness was revealed for what it was, a scattering of weary men, ropes limp in their hands, torches nothing but smoldering sticks. What had seemed mighty in darkness looked small in dawn. The Apache warrior stood tall, his brother pressed close against his side. The boy's silence remained, but it no longer felt brittle with fear, it felt whole, steadied by the weight of kinship. His small frame leaned into the warrior's leg, and his eyes no longer fixed on the ground but on the horizon, where the desert stretched wide and endless, promising escape. The mob was broken. They lingered out of shame, not rage, there. Heads bowed, their mouths dry of excuses. Tom Jeffers tried once more to summon the bluster that had carried him through the night. He spat in the dust, muttered something about next time, but the words rang hollow. None followed him. The courage to lynch a boy had vanished in the light of a woman's defiance and a warrior's presence. Ellen Hayes remained where she had stood all night. Her back was no longer straight as iron fatigue had seeped into her bones, making her legs tremble, but she did not let them see her bend. Her hands were steady at her sides, her chin lifted, her eyes meeting the dawn with quiet certainty. She had done what she had come to do. She had kept the boy alive, until the sun could judge them all. The warrior turned fully to her now. His dark eyes held hers for a long breath, searching, weighing, seeing. Then, without a word, he placed his hand firmly on his brother's shoulder and guided him a step aside. He faced her squarely in the street. The mob hushed, every man waiting. Some expected anger, perhaps even vengeance, that the warrior might raise his rifle, strike down the woman who had dared touch his kin, or curse her in words none of them would understand. Instead, he did something no one in Dry Creek could have predicted. He bowed, not low, not with submission, but with dignity. His head inclined slowly, his shoulders dipping just enough to carry the weight of the gesture. It was not the bow of a man to a superior, nor of a supplicant to a judge. It was the bow of one warrior to another, one soul recognizing the courage of another soul, regardless of blood or border. The gesture struck the mob harder than any bullet. Men who had mocked Ellen as foolish, who had called her traitor, now saw her honored in a way they themselves had never been. None of them had earned a bow from an Apache warrior. None of them had stood unyielding against the night. The shame of their own weakness grew heavier with that silent tribute. Ellen's breath caught. She felt the sting of tears in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she inclined her head in return, the faintest of nods meeting his. Gesture with her own. She had not done what she did for honor, yet to receive it from him, who had every reason to mistrust her kind, was more than she had words to carry. The boy glanced up at her then, his dark eyes lingering on her face. He gave no smile, no word, but the look was enough. She would remember it longer than any thanks. The warrior took his brother's hand and turned without another sound. Together they walked to the horse waiting at the edge of town. The boy scrambled up with ease, the warrior mounting behind him. The horse snorted, pawed the earth, then carried them swiftly westward, their figures growing smaller against the rising sun until they vanished into the shimmering expanse of the desert. The street remained silent long after they had gone. One by one, the townsmen drifted away, ashamed to meet Ellen's eyes. Even Jeffers turned his back, shoulders hunched, muttering curses too quiet to matter. Soon only the dust remained, swirling softly in the morning light. Ellen stood alone, her body aching, her throat raw, but her spirit unbroken. She closed her eyes, drawing a slow breath, letting the desert wind carry away the night stench of smoke and fury. When she opened them again, the prairie stretched wide before her, endless and untamed. Somewhere out there, a boy lived because she had chosen to stand. Somewhere out there, a warrior carried her name in silence, not as enemy, but as one who had earned respect, and Dry Creek, whether it wished to or not, would remember.